And thanks again to everyone for weighing in and logging in for the third session. We want to look this evening at the birth of confessional states when the island was partitioned in 1920, and then the formation of Northern Ireland on the 3rd of May 1921, and the rest of the history that moved to the formation of what then became the Free State on the 6th of December 1922. What happened was we ended up with two very confessional states, and in the first part of the evening we'll try and explore the Catholic side of that story, and then in the second half we look at the Protestant state and the Protestant side of that story. But first of all, 1934, James Craig, the Northern Ireland Prime Minister, said that he was an Orangeman first and a politician and an MP afterwards. And most, if not all, of his cabinet would have made the same claim. All I boast, he said, is that we are a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state. And the deep insecurity and sense of being in a constant state of emergency hardened Unionist attitudes and behaviours towards the 33.5% Catholic population now in what is Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, the southern state is somewhat hostile to Unionists, did not understand them, made little or no attempt to engage with Unionist thinking and mindsets, and in 1926 Catholics were 92.6% of the Free State population. Catholics were being discriminated against in Northern Ireland, and Protestants experienced discrimination, especially in a county like Donegal. And Craig's claim to be an Orangeman first and to be a Protestant state was a response to De Valera's claim in 1931 that he was a Catholic first. It was not just that the two leaders were nailing their confessional flags to the mast. They were, in fact, leading confessional states. One was Catholic and the other was Protestant. We'll look a little bit at a pre-partition confessionalism. From the 16th century until 1870, Ireland had an established church. Anglicans, or the Church of Ireland, were the state church of the minority. And church and state together ruled and were responsible for penal laws oppressive of the majority Catholics and later the Presbyterians. The British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, introduced a bill to disestablish the Church of Ireland, and on the 1st of January 1871, there was no longer a state church in Ireland. There was, though, a process in motion at this stage to really culturally establish the churches. And a key player in Catholicism was Archbishop Paul Cullen, Archbishop of Armagh in 1849 and in 1852 Archbishop of Dublin. Now, Cullen was a strong advocate of the ultramontane position, believing that the church in the Pope had ultimate authority in things temporal as well as spiritual. And over a 20-year period, he set about revolutionizing the Irish Catholic Church. His revolution began with the Synod of Fairness in 1850. Discipline was tightened, devotions were made uniform under the strict control of clergy, strict Sunday observance was introduced, and there was a disciplined attendance at confession and Eucharist. Cullen centralized and Romanized, if you like, the Catholic Church in Ireland and clericalized it. Clergy now had almost an absolute authority, and a powerful church was beginning to dominate every aspect of life. Referred to as the colonization of the church, it was the church, this church, that dominated Irish life until the 1970s, when Cullen's institutional Catholicism began to break down. Cullen had not wanted to replace the disestablished Church of Ireland with an established state Catholic Church. But the colonized Catholic Church was culturally established and was central to the confessional state that emerged in 1921. The church and state already had developed close links before partition. The 19th century following Catholic emancipation in 1829 had seen the emergence of an increasingly politicized and confident Catholic community. The Oxford Companion to Irish History puts it like this: as Irish Catholics re-entered political, economic and cultural life, the Catholic community took on aspects of an established church, without, however, having legal ties to the state. State funding for primary education in national schools became an arena of church-state cooperation. Other areas of relating and cooperating followed, though clerical power was beginning to decline by the time Charles Stewart Parnell was leader of Irish nationalism. The Oxford Companion again, whether the clerical church desired it or not, and despite the deep divisions left by the Parnell affair, late 19th century Catholicism found itself grafted onto Irish nationalism. And whatever the bishops may have thought of the Sinn Féin victory of 1918, they were obliged to acquiesce in their people's political decision. Well, let's look a little more closely at Catholic religion and the Catholic state. The first constitution of the Free State was drafted by the Provisional Government and ratified in December 1922. It was neutral in relation to the church and religion. That, of course, changed when De Valera introduced a new constitution in 1937. The latter constitution was rooted in Catholic theology and social teaching. And despite the neutrality of the 1922 Constitution, William T. Cosgrave, who was president of the Executive Council, was a devout Catholic and conservative in his religious outlook. The Church, disturbed by the Civil War, was keen to re-establish its moral authority and assert itself in Irish life. Even before the Provisional Government, Sinn Féin was happy to acquiesce in the church influence. The new Free State was hardly revolutionary, and a still powerful church, even though some of its clerical power had diminished, was always going to assert itself in public life and the political system or state, to accept, if not welcome it. It was a confessional state with state religion, and certain moments give expression to the inseparable relationship. The Catholic bishops wanted, for example, censorship and compulsory Irish. These would be positively moral, the church believed. W.B. Yeats in the Irish Times protested, only to be described by the Catholic media, asserting the, quote, not so hidden hand of the old Protestant ascendancy. The Irish Times was dubbed an anti-Irish and anti-Catholic journal. The Centenary of Catholic Emancipation was a high-profile event in 1929. It was not only a high-profile Catholic event, but a major focus on a past Catholic experience that was indeed worthy of remembering. It was also the year when Cosgrave gave way to the Catholic Church and passed the Censorship of Publications Act. De Valera was back in the Dáil and had polled well with his new party, and obviously a threat to Cosgrave. Cosgrave was not going to spoil his relationship with the Catholic Church, so the Church was victorious. It got its Censorship Act, banning books that promoted what were described as criminal behaviour, advocated abortion or contraception, or incited immorality or unnatural vice. A censorship board was established, and all of this was the expression of Catholic Irishness. What it meant to be Irish seemed to be about what you were against. You were, as Marcus Tanner put it, against sexuality. You were against the English. Archbishop Gilmartin of Tuam campaigned against jazz music as a mesmeric rhythm of sensuality. For Gilmartin, the materialistic world was a grave threat to distinctive nationality and the souls of a free Catholic Ireland. The next major public event was the Eucharistic Congress, International Eucharistic Congress, which was held in Dublin's Phoenix Park in 1932. Now, the park had been the location of the Vice-Regal Lodge and the Chief Secretary's Lodge, but in 1922 the Protestant British Lords Lieutenant and Chief Secretaries had left to be replaced by the Irish Catholic Governor-General and then Irish Presidents, the American Ambassador and the Papal Nuncio. Now, the latter was a big statement of the state's Catholicism. The Eucharistic Congress was also marking the 1500th anniversary of St. Patrick's mission to Ireland. Now, interestingly, the Church of Ireland held a separate event celebrating and claiming St. Patrick for itself, and the day where the Church descended from Patrick. For the final Mass in Phoenix Park, 1 million people attended, no previous Eucharistic Congress attracting such large numbers. The papal legate, the chief celebrant, had arrived in Dún Laoghaire, welcomed by 5,000 children. Archbishop Byrne of Dublin welcomed the legate, followed by the new president of the Executive Council, De Valera, who greeted the legate in Irish and Latin. The legate was then greeted in turn by the other members of the Executive Council. As the legate drove through Dublin, thousands fell on their knees. He greeted the Irish bishops in the Pro-Cathedral, and in the evening he was given a state reception at the Royal Dublin Society. The Congress came to an end with a solemn pontifical high mass, at the end of which a huge procession of the Blessed Sacrament moved off to the city centre. The sacrament was followed by cardinals, archbishops, and bishops, followed by the members of the Dole and Senate, and members of Dublin Corporation. It was a massive church-state event, a confessional state consistently in the 1930s, turning out thousands for processions of different kinds. In June 1929, 500,000 had gone to Phoenix Park for a mass celebrating the centenary of Catholic Emancipation. In 1936, Corpus Christi processions drew 40,000 to Cork, 20,000 in Limerick, 15,000 in Waterford. And in the same year at a Catholic Truth Society conference in Tuam, 40,000 attended the Mass. Cosgrave and De Valera were canopy bearers in 1929. The politicians of the Free State held the monstrance in the procession after the Mass. A Catholic newspaper in 1936 wrote that the Catholic Church had a blessed year in Ireland. Quote again, the Catholic Church's confidence in its own ability to rule Ireland was almost limitless. The respect and obedience it drew from its faithful, almost total. In the 1930s, there was a sense that the Catholic Revolution, launched by Cardinal Cullen 3/4 of a century before, had finally achieved its potential, and that the Church's influence now permeated each and every village in a way it had never done since the Middle Ages. In 1932, the men who had opposed the treaty, triggering a civil war, were now in government. De Valera and Fianna Fáil coming to power in 1932 coincided with the Church's display of militant and imperialistic Catholicism. 5 years later, De Valera introduced a new constitution. It was largely De Valera's work, drafted by a small team of civil servants closely supervised by him. The preamble to that constitution is profoundly religious, invoking the Trinity and a Christology, a Christ, who sounded suspiciously like someone who'd been with Pierce in the 1916 Rising. Christ, it was claimed, had sustained the fathers through centuries of trial, remembering their heroic and unremitting struggle to regain the rightful independence of our nation. And so Christ was identified with nationalism and the national Catholic struggle. That language alienated many Protestants, as had the Congress of 1932. In the new Free State, were Protestants Irish? Could they be Irish? The Catholic Church was given a special position in the Constitution. The Catholic Archbishop McQuaid of Dublin was actually insisting and demanding exclusive recognition for the Catholic Church, and this was really the status of a state church. Now, to De Valera's credit, he resisted this, conferred with other church leaders, and the Constitution gave recognition to, quote, the Church of Ireland, the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, the Methodist Church in Ireland, the Religious Society of Friends in Ireland, as well as the Jewish congregations and the other religious denominations existing in Ireland at the date of the coming into operation of this Constitution. Offence was avoided through the Constitution, though the Constitution recognised the special position of the Holy Catholic Church as the guardian of the faith professed by the great majority of its citizens. Well, I suppose the latter was true, but this was not an atmosphere for a secular constitution, which was provided some time later for a deeply religious country of India. Why not Ireland? Article 44 of the Irish Constitution was abolished by referendum in 1972. Catholic social teaching was embedded in the 1937 Constitution. Articles 40 to 45 were very much Catholic influenced, dealing with fundamental rights concerning family, education, private property, and religion. The status accorded to women was confined to the kitchen, and very much a subordinate role, now, of course, recognised as sexist. In June 1937, the Constitution was accepted by referendum, claiming in Article 3 jurisdiction over Northern Ireland angered Unionists, but it was removed by referendum after the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 by a 94% vote. The Free State, the Republic of Ireland, after 1949, there became the Republic of Ireland in 1949, was a confessional state with a strong church-state relationship, a Catholic state with a state religion, at least culturally established. But in the 1970s, perhaps even the late 1960s, certainly the early 1970s, things began to change. And today, Cullen's Church is history. In 2018, the final separation of church and state became a reality. Okay, we'll pause there and let's have a conversation, see what we make of that. People may have their own stories, your own questions, observations. But if we can unmute and have a conversation, after the second part of the evening, we'll go into groups and have a smaller group discussion then. Hello.
Hello, hearing you okay, Johnston?
Okay,
yes.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I wasn't sure. Okay, let's look at the Protestant religion in the Protestant state. And in a sense, the Protestant churches had a similar role in Northern Ireland, always closely identified with unionism from its earliest beginnings in the 19th century and with the Ulster Unionist Council after 1905. The Protestant churches, it seemed, had no theological, ethical, or political difficulty with something like the Ulster Covenant in 1912. The unionism, the God and the guns that was embodied in the covenant were approved by the churches, and if judged by church statements during the Home Rule crises, especially in 1912, Protestant theology was state theology and civil religion. The passion and heat with which those churches opposed Home Rule dissipated after, if not even before, partition. The churches opposed Home Rule and then accepted it in a partitioned Ireland. They were happy to be part of a Protestant state for Protestant people. And Northern Ireland had also taken on the characteristics of a confessional state, even though the tenets of one faith were not enshrined in a constitution. The situation was different from the South, where Catholic faith was enshrined in a 1937 constitution and where the Protestant minority was small. The Protestant state and the Protestant churches in the north were living with a large and disaffected minority of Catholics. And as the Northern government began to dismantle the Government of Ireland Act through its abolition of proportional representation, which was meant to make for a fairer and more representative electoral process, and moved on to create gerrymandered electoral constituencies, constructing systems of discrimination, there was no moral voice from the churches. The first issue that would test the moral fibre of the Protestant churches, and whether they were or were not to be instruments of state religion, was education. 2 weeks before King George V opened the Northern Ireland Parliament in Belfast City Hall, the Presbyterian General Assembly looked at a programme of social reform. Meeting for the first time in the new reality of Northern Ireland and very conscious of a parliament about to be opened, the Presbyterians believed this programme to be in the interests of the kingdom of God and could be achieved, they felt, within the next 10 years. It put forward industrial, social, moral, and benevolent reforms. It looked very like a programme for government, and the Assembly was obviously hoping to influence the new Parliament. And first on the list of reforms was education, an indication as to how important that was to the Presbyterian Church, and would be as Northern Ireland took shape. Now, there was nothing sectarian about the proposed educational reforms, and the Presbyterians urged the Catholic Church to play a part in shaping an educational system, which was being drawn up by the Minister for Education, Lord Londonderry. The Catholic Church declined to nominate anyone to a newly appointed Education Committee. Londonderry's committee met a few months after the General Assembly had unanimously accepted their programme of social reform. So this Education Committee, which is a Protestant-only committee, Catholic Church refusing again to recognise the education system, met in the context of sectarian violence. The committee did produce reforms, but got stuck on a religious question. Church of Ireland Bishop Grierson of Down, a member of the committee, raised a thorny question for Protestants. The bishop felt that religion should be taught in schools, and that merely secular education, he said, does a cruel wrong to a child. The issue was about how religious instruction is given in state schools. Should religion be taught in such schools? Londonderry's educational system was to be non-denominational, more secular. Londonderry brought forward his Education Act, and the Protestant churches mounted their opposition. It was not just about the Bible in education. It was about how teachers were appointed and how schools were managed. Schools were to be transferred to the state, but Protestant churches still wanted control in relation to management and teacher appointment. And in 1923, representatives of the Church of Ireland and Presbyterian churches demanded changes in the provisions made for the appointment of teachers and for the management of schools. In December of 1924, the churches established a United Education Committee, UEC, headed by the denominational education conveners, the Reverends W. Corgi, Presbyterian, J. Quinn, Church of Ireland, and W. H. Smith, Methodist. When the committee met in February 1925, representatives of the Orange Order and Unionists also attended. This was a formidable religio-political body to assert or defend Protestant education. It was widely believed that Protestant education was under threat. And if the current system was accepted, they said, Bolsheviks, atheists, or Roman Catholics could become teachers in Protestant schools. Prime Minister James Craig, in the absence of the Education Minister, met with the UEC, and members of the Orange Order caved in very quickly, and a week later an amending act was given royal assent. By 1925, Northern Ireland had a state education system that was Protestant. Teachers were required to teach, quote, a programme of simple Bible instruction. The Bible, so central to the Protestant churches, was at the heart of religious instruction in state Protestant schools. Clergy were involved in school management and had a say in the appointment of teachers. It would be difficult for someone not a Protestant to be appointed a teacher. It did not end there. There was Stranmillis Training College, and the Protestant churches were demanding representation on its management. Stranmillis was established in 1929. In a new Education Act of 1930, the Protestant churches, in a sense, got all they wanted, and each of the denominations expressed their satisfaction. Settlement of Stranmillis took a little longer. And the UEC kept up the pressure. In August 1931, the UEC met in Belfast, chaired by the Church of Ireland Bishop of Clogher, and included in attendance the Church of Ireland Bishop of Derry, the President of the Methodist Church in Ireland, and the Principal of the Presbyterian Assemblies College. Their cause was greatly helped by Catholic Bishop McCrory, who at the end of the year created a great storm with his extraordinary statement, perhaps not so extraordinary, in 1931, quote, that the Protestant Church in Ireland, and the same is true of the Protestant Church anywhere else, is not only not the rightful representative of the early Irish Church, but is not even part of the Church of Christ. That, he said, is my proposition. Well, the outrage was predictable. The determination enhanced to pursue full Protestant representation on the management of Stranmillis College. And by 1932, 3 representatives were appointed. State education was to have the powerful role of the Protestant churches and clergy. It was a sectarian issue. It was quite openly spelt out by one of the church representatives. He said, we cannot afford to be divided in Northern Ireland. And if the government of Northern Ireland is to stand and be strong, it must have the goodwill of the Protestant churches. Irish historian A.K. Atkinson has given an insightful appraisal of the role of Protestant clergy in the development of the educational system in Northern Ireland, writing, no band of Catholic priests in the former United Ireland had engaged in politics with the energy and efficacy of the Protestant clerics who led the United Education Committee of the Protestant churches. The reality was there were 2 confessional states in Ireland. Now, it's important, perhaps, before we go into smaller groups and discuss some of these questions, important to identify the roots of the religion at the heart of the Northern confessional state. They go back to the earliest beginnings of unionism, and indeed the earlier foundation of the Orange Order in 1795. The British state has never been trusted. The earliest unionist leader, Colonel Edward Saunderson, told Orangemen in 1892 that Ulster loyalism must trust to their own strength and unflinching determination, and this in relation to the British state. For Saunderson, there is, quote, a contractual threat to the British state that loyalism is conditional on the defence of Protestant values. It was this contractualism that enabled Ulster Protestants to be prepared to fight the British to remain British in 1912 and the years following. The covenant was understood as contractual. And although the Presbyterian framer of the covenant and Protestant churches which approved it in 1912, although they all thought it had biblical rootage, it was diametrically opposed to the biblical vision, which is neighbourly in relation to economic systems and practice, and not contractual. At the heart of the contractual or conditioned loyalty was Protestant Evangelicalism. Evangelicalism had emerged in Ireland during the 18th century, Methodism being an early, though not the only, expression. It soon dominated the ethos and belief of the Protestant churches. Evangelicalism provided a sacred canopy for politics. In David Hempton's words, it supplied the sacred framework within which the Protestant landlords of the frontier counties of Ulster resisted the apparently inexorable advance of Catholicism, nationalism, and tenant rights. As the 19th century moved into the 20th, and rapid social and political change occurred, Hempton's words again, evangelical religion was one of the central forces shaping the Ulster Protestant identity. Evangelicalism was not only the bedrock of Unionist political identity, it brought the toxin of religious sectarianism along with it. It was anti-Catholic, and the air that was breathed by the Ulster or much of the Ulster Protestant community. There were, of course, exceptions, but with minority status. And sometimes in terms of their politics, they were more nationalist than they were unionist. But Ulster Unionism and evangelicalism were synonymous and pervaded by sectarianism. The covenant signed in 1912 had no doubt that the Ulster Protestants had God on their side, and this was given expression in the slogan of the time, for God and Ulster. Hempton summarises it in this way. By the last quarter of the 19th century, evangelical religion had fundamentally shaped the outlook of that community and supplied a convenient religious explanation for its inherent sense of superiority. Economic progress, moral regeneration, a conservative social code, and loyalty to the monarchy were all regarded as distinctive characteristics of Protestant Ulster.
Yep.
The indivisibility of evangelicalism and political unionism and identity was to continue into the 1990s, when it was challenged by the evangelical contribution on Northern Ireland, otherwise known as Econi. And this evangelical group, perhaps it had to be a group like that, challenged the civil religion model that was represented, and as they were saying, the idolatry which underpinned it. The Econi contribution was courageous, and it drew bitter opposition from within the evangelical and unionist community. But it did succeed in breaking down the close connection between religious and political identity, but not without the formation of a rigid opposition, which was to be a minority movement within the wider evangelical sector. The separation of religion and politics, or church and state, was also being influenced at this time by a faith in politics group, an ecumenical group, and by the educational programs of the Irish School of Ecumenics. The place of Reformed Protestants and their theology also underpin the Ulster Protestant stance and politics. Much of this is evangelical, though a distinct version of evangelicalism. The Reformed tradition is rooted in covenant and understood in terms of a special covenant relationship between God and God's people. They are a chosen people, which tends to lend itself to exceptionalism. It also becomes politicized and invests political aspirations with divine sanction, ultimate sanction. There is little or no room for compromise or consensus. In the Reformed or Presbyterian tradition, the largest Protestant tradition in Northern Ireland, with roots in 16th century plantation, there is a bedrock of belief that can be unshakable, close to religious and political pluralism, and therefore in the context of Northern Ireland, the presence of a culturally established, if you like, state religion. David Hempton describes it like this: grounded in a belief in a personal God, commitment to a particular land, unwavering hostility to perceived enemies, obedience to a divinely sanctioned legal code, adherence to a prophetical interpretation of human destiny, and the employment of biblical language and thought forms to interpret the wider world. Now, there is a tradition of Presbyterian radicalism, evident in the 1790s and strong at that time in Belfast as elsewhere in the northeast of Ireland. But it was not in the vanguard at the partition of Ireland and the building of the new state of Northern Ireland. That radical Presbyterianism has never gone away, but has had significant, though limited, impact. As the centenary of partition is marked in this year, I suppose the separation of church and state is as real in Northern Ireland as it is now in the Republic. This is a much more secular Ireland, north and south. And as Catholicism is a theologically, socially, and politically disempowered and deprivileged religion in the south, so evangelicalism and the once influential Reformed tradition are perhaps theologically, socially, and politically disempowered and deprivileged in the north. By looking back to the role and status of the churches 100 years ago and where they are now in Ireland, starkly, I think, reveals how much has changed. And maybe the churches have barely begun to acknowledge the change. Well, we'll move into rooms thanks to our technician. There are a couple of questions which will come up on the bottom of the screen. Why did both states become confessional states? Did the politicians want it, or did the churches impose it in a pursuit of power, or was it mutual? And looking to the future, whatever that future may be, are we prepared to live with a secular constitution, settle for a much more secular society? Well, see what you make of that. We'll take 15 minutes.